Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and I'm here today at the British Royal Armouries taking a look at some of the very rare cool prototypes that they have in their reference collection, like this Swiss Intermediate-Cartridge copy of the FG-42. This is an incredibly cool gun that is just so perfectly everything Forgotten Weapons. So, this was developed in the years just after World War II, when Switzerland is looking to replace its bolt-action K31s with some sort of self-loading firearm. And there is a significant competition that goes on for not quite 10 years, for about 8 years, between primarily the two big firearms manufacturing entities in Switzerland, that being SIG and Waffenfabrik Bern. Now, they're going to experiment with intermediate cartridges here, partly because the German use of the 8mm Kurz in World War II really made a big impact on a lot of countries. Everyone looked at that. Not everyone followed it. The Russians would end up following it. NATO ended up not following it. But everyone was interested and curious about it. But Bern actually had been experimenting with intermediate cartridges all the way back into the 1920s. And this is largely the result of the longtime director of Bern, a guy named Adolph Furrer, who you may know better as a guy who was obsessed with toggle locking actions. He developed and Bern manufactured the toggle locking light machine gun that the Swiss adopted, the LMG-25, as well as a toggle locked submachine gun, the MP-41-44. I have a video on that if you're interested in checking it out. But aside from toggle locking, Furrer was really interested in intermediate length cartridges, and they experimented with a variety of them in the 20s and 30s. They would revive that in 1946 when this development program began. So this is obviously, and even more so once we start taking it apart, obviously based on the Swiss getting their hands on some FG-42s and looking at copying that mechanism, but using a short intermediate length cartridge. Specifically, this was 7.5 by 38 millimeters. Very similar to 8mm Kurz, but in 7.5 and based on some prior work done by Bern. So this is the WF-51 pattern. The program basically began in 51. This is the first really significant model that was manufactured. And they made a total of 35 of these for troop trials. They are awesome. So let's take a look inside it. It's really cool to look at the obvious hybrid nature of this as both distinctively Swiss, note the very recognizable Swiss beer keg charging handle, but also absolutely FG-42. The sights are FG-42. The configuration in this sort of quasi bullpup setup where the magazine is set on the side. The reason for this is if you have the magazine coming out the bottom, it takes up a lot of real estate. You would have to move the whole fire control group back. In theory, you can do sights off the top, but that's typically not used on shoulder rifles, only on support weapons that are typically fired from a bipod. And so you end up with this compromise of mag off on the side. Other FG-42 elements we have here are, of course, this spring steel, spring, holding the pins in place to keep the fire control group in place. We have dust covers for both sides of the magazine, well, magazine and ejection port, although this one's a little bit bent and doesn't want to, that one doesn't want to snap in place, so we'll leave it alone. We have a selector switch here. We'll get to the operation of this more in a few minutes, but E is single shot, Einzelfeuer, M is something, abbreviation for full auto. You pull the pin out, sorry, let's do that so you can see it. You pull the pin out, it's fairly tough, and then rotate that around to switch fire modes. And we also have a push button, safety, right here, that is safe on one side, and there's safe. Push it through, and we have fire. This gun is serial number 121, which is marked on virtually all of the parts. This is out of, like I said, a run of 35 of them. They were numbered 101 through 135. The rear sight is a bit loose, unfortunately, but it is clearly an FG-42 sight. In order to change the range, you push down on that diopter and then rotate the drum here. And it seems pretty clear to me that they had an optic planned for this gun, because these mounting points, we don't have the optics mount, we don't have the optic itself. I haven't seen pictures of one of these with an optic, but clearly that's what they intended there. At the front end, we have an obvious copy of the second pattern FG-42 brake. We have a hooded front sight, which does fold down just like the FG did. Bayonet lug out there. So instead of the really basic spike style sort of de facto bayonet, this was set up for a typical modern style of bayonet. You saw the bipod set up earlier. It's going to fold down, mounts at the rear, again, like in this case, like the first pattern FG-42. And that, by the way, detaches very easily. We just have a little wire clip there. Can undo that, pop it off, and there's our bipod assembly. Just simple stamped sheet metal legs. The magazine for the WF-51 is basically a copy of the Sturmgewehr mag. It's even, like, you look at it up here, it even looks like a Sturmgewehr mag in many of its construction elements. In fact, here is a Sturmgewehr mag. The Swiss one has just a little bit more taper to it, but you can see that the ribs, the over travel stops, everything here is clearly a copy. Obviously, the Swiss magazine is a little bit longer, 38 millimeters instead of 33 for the case length, but also distinctively, it doesn't, the Sturmgewehr, the Swiss mag does not have the rear reinforcing sort of T-slot here that the German magazine does. Also, no hold open tab on the Swiss one. All right, enough of that. Let's take this thing apart. This is super cool. Disassembly is going to mirror the FG-42, except kind of simpler in every way. So instead of having to push in a button and compress a buffer assembly, we just have this catch right here. Push that down. We can slide off the buttstock assembly, which is sheet metal with wood wrapped around it. That's nothing says expensive like combining FG-42 and Swiss. Next up, we have a recoil spring, a lot of recoil spring in there, and that is locked into this rear lug. So this spring retainer is set in the receiver, and to remove it, I'm going to push the spring in, rotate it. You can see the little hole there because the spring guide is keyed, so it'll come out right there. There is quite a lot of recoil spring inside this thing. There's the whole thing. Then we can pull out this retaining block at the end of the receiver. Then the bolt's going to come out. We pull it back to here, slide the bolt handle out. It's got a little dovetail. And then we can pull the trigger to release this. We can pull out the bolt and gas piston and bolt carrier assembly. So here is our major difference from the FG-42. The FG had a rotating bolt, and the Swiss went for essentially a tipping bolt. So that right there is the locking surface, and it's going to lock upward in the receiver. So this is the locked position. This is the unlocked position. You can see this tail is going to travel in a little groove in the bolt carrier, which is going to force this locking lug up and down. And that square right there is the reinforced locking shoulder in the receiver. So when the gun's locked in battery, it's going to be sitting basically just like that. Now, like the FG, this is going to fire, in theory, from an open bolt in full auto and a closed bolt in semi-auto. And when the gun is in battery ready to fire, it's actually in this position unlocked. And when you pull the trigger, it releases, the sear releases this bolt carrier and piston, which is under spring pressure from this big old spring. That is going to push the bolt carrier forward, which will lock the bolt and have the firing pin protrude through. So also, like the FG, we have a little tower here that locks into a tab in the firing pin right there. So the firing pin is actually held by the bolt carrier at all times and sliding inside the bolt as the bolt carrier moves forward and back. So again, this is a mechanism taken directly from the FG. They just sort of translated it into a tilting bolt with that locking lug instead of a rotating bolt. The FG-42, the German one, is actually kind of a pain to assemble and disassemble because of significant spring tension on all the parts. This is far gentler, far easier to work with, and just beautifully made. Next up, let's take the grip assembly off. This is a mechanism that if you were in the US Army a while back, you may recognize from the M60, which took it from the original German FG-42, where we have a sheet metal spring steel sheet metal spring retainer clamp that hooks on the rear pin, locks this, which is the selector lever, and locks the front pin in place. So our rear pin is loose and it just fell out. Our front pin is tighter, but we can flip this over and pull out our front pin, and then the fire control group just lifts off like that. You can see two lugs here that lock into the two pinholes there. So that gives us our barreled action here. In theory, you could take a wrench to this, pull this off, then this plate comes off, and then the two sides of the handguard would come off, but there's nothing under here. Well, there's a gas block under there, I suppose. Actually, there is definitely a gas block under there, but this is tight in place, and I don't want to go around messing with that. So you know what a gas block looks like. It's under there, feeds into the gas tube right down there. One of the interesting mysteries about this particular gun is that I can take the selector lever out, and all of the fire control parts, well, almost all of them, are welded together. So this originally was a select fire gun that was open bolt full auto and closed bolt semi-auto, and it has been rendered somehow, and this is obviously part of, from the trials process, this has been turned into a semi-auto only closed bolt gun. I have no idea why, and I'm not really sure how the original fire control group worked, because they've welded this down and then ground it flat. We do still have the original part numbers on here, at least some of them. We have 1, 2 there. We have 2, 1 here. The gun serial number is 121. So take from that what you will. This is the semi-auto disconnector. Our trigger here just lifts that. When this fire control group is in place, so pulling the trigger here is going to drop this sear. When the bolt goes forward over the disconnector here, it will pop it off to the side, which resets the trigger. When you release the trigger, well, when the bolt comes back over, it's going to reset that just slightly. And you have to pull the trigger a second time to fire a second shot. So it's locked in semi-auto mode. And with this modification in here at this point, I really don't have anything to go with on exactly how the original selector switch functioned. Right now, moving the selector switch does nothing. There is no difference in parts here between when it's set to semi and when it's set to full. That said, I can very easily show you how the safety works, and that is simply that when you have it set to safe, it prevents the sear from dropping because that little tab hits the body of the safety bar. When I have it in fire, it will drop. So the safety is super easy, just not sure how that selector system originally worked. There you are. There is the Waffenfabrik Bern WF-51 Swiss Intermediate-Cartridge copy of the FG-42, all field stripped. So 35 of this pattern were manufactured. They were sent out to troop trials. Unfortunately, I don't have any records of the results of those trials, but we know that the gun, first off, didn't do well enough to just win outright at that point, but it also didn't do badly enough to get kicked out, because Bern would go on to do 4 more patterns of these in 1953, 54, 55, and 56, before ultimately losing the final competition to what was adopted, of course, as the Sturmgewehr 57, which was the SIG, the SIG 510 series. So ultimately, by the end of this trials process, they've abandoned the intermediate cartridges. They've returned to a full power cartridge. It's the same Swiss standard full power cartridge, 7.5x55 or GP11. And we will actually be doing a future video coming up on one of the full-size versions of, well, later iterations of this same development process. But I will happily say, without any doubt at all, having looked now at all of the post-war takes on the FG-42, the British one, the American version that eventually turns into the M60, and the Swiss pattern here, this is undoubtedly the best one, and this would be, I think, a fantastic gun to shoot. Extremely cool. I'm kind of giddy looking at this, if you haven't noticed already. So, before I say anything stupid and embarrassing, I will cut this video off. Big thanks to the British Royal Armouries for giving me access to this to show to you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did, although I kind of doubt it. But thanks for watching.